The forest that waits. Stop them dead. Hook. What happens when you venture too deep into a forest that doesn't just watch, but waits for you? This isn't a tale of survival, but a chilling story of becoming part of the darkness forever. Stay with us until the end, because what you're about to hear will make you question the very nature of the forest and your place in it. Don't blink. Don't look away. This is where the journey ends and the real terror begins. The wind howled through the trees. It cut through the dense forest like a knife. Jonah crouched low, barely breathing. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a warning. The forest was silent, too silent. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just the eerie creak of branches swaying in the wind. He tightened his grip on the rifle. His fingers were slick with sweat. He forced himself to stay still. He could hear them now, faintly. The soft scrape of boots on the earth. A shadow passed through the trees. Jonah's breath hitched. His pulse raced. He had been waiting for this. For hours. For days. The whispers had led him here. The stories of people vanishing. Of something in the woods. Something watching. Jonah's eyes scanned the darkness. Every movement felt like a trap. Every sound was amplified. A twig snapped behind him. Jonah froze. He slowly turned his head. Nothing. He exhaled sharply. Then he heard it. A low growl. Not far off. Jonah's breath caught. The growl was followed by footsteps. Heavy. Steady. Someone or something was coming closer. Jonah's hand tightened around the rifle. He could feel his legs shaking. The forest had swallowed him whole. The light was fading. The shadows grew longer. Closer. He could hear the breathing now. Ragged. Slow. Jonah felt it. Something was watching him. He wasn't alone. Then the scream. It was sharp, desperate. He turned to see a figure. A pale face. Eyes wide in terror. Blood smeared across its lips. A hand reached out. It grabbed his arm. Jonah jerked away, heart in his throat. The figure was gone. Only the eerie sound of wind remained. The growl. Closer now. Jonah had to stop them. Before it was too late, he rose to his feet. The rifle aimed straight ahead. He waited, eyes scanning the dark, breath shallow, and then nothing. The forest held its breath. Then came the voices, low, murmuring, too many voices, a storm of whispers. Stop them dead. Jonah's finger twitched on the trigger. He wasn't ready, but they were coming. Silence, complete and total silence. Jonah's lungs burned. His body trembled, still frozen, but there was no more grip on his throat. The figure was gone. The air was thick with something different now. Heavy. Cold. Jonah gasped, sucking in air. His vision returned slowly. He could see the trees again, the shadows. But something was wrong. The forest felt off. The stillness was unnatural. He forced himself to his feet. Every muscle screamed in protest. His throat burned. His breath shallow. He looked around but saw nothing. Nothing at all. Just the endless dark. The whispers were gone. No more growling. No more voices. Jonah swallowed hard. The rifle was still in his hands, cold and lifeless. He had to move. He had to find a way out. But the forest, it felt like it was closing in on him. The trees leaned closer. The shadows deepened. Jonah stumbled forward. Each step felt like it was dragging him down. A strange weight pressed on his chest. His legs shook with exhaustion, but he kept going. There was something in the air now, a strange, suffocating presence, like the very forest was alive, watching, waiting. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. A footstep, heavy, slow. Jonah froze. It was behind him. Then another, closer. The breathing, ragged, labored. He turned quickly. The figure was there, no longer in the shadows. no longer distant. It stood just feet away. Its eyes glowed, flickering, faint like dying embers. The smile twisted on its face, a grotesque mockery of a human expression. Jonah's legs froze. He couldn't run. He couldn't scream. The figure reached out, slow and deliberate. The coldness radiated from it. Jonah's body went numb. The figure's lips parted, and the words came again. Stop them dead. This time, the voice was his own. It wasn't the figure. It was his voice. Jonah's heart stopped. He reached up to his own throat, but it wasn't his hand. It was the figure's hand. The grip tightened, and then everything went dark again. The darkness was suffocating. Jonah couldn't breathe. His mind was spinning, but there was no pain, no air, just a deep, consuming black. Then a faint light flickered, just a sliver. Far away, Jonah tried to move toward it, but his limbs were heavy. He couldn't feel them. He was trapped in this void. The light pulsed again, closer this time. He reached for it, with what strength he had left. His fingers brushed something cold. The light flared, a flash of blinding brightness. Then a voice, familiar, whispering, "Stop them dead." Jonah gasped, his eyes snapping open. He was back in the forest. The air was thick with fog. Everything felt wrong. The trees were closer now, their twisted branches looming overhead. He was no longer standing, no longer able to move. The figure stood before him again, its pale face glowing in the fog, its eyes dark, yet burning. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The figure reached for him, slowly, steady. Its hand hovered above his chest. Jonah couldn't stop it. He couldn't stop them. The cold spread through him. He could feel it, seeping into his skin, filling his veins. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't breathe. The whispering voices rose, all around him. Stop them dead. Jonah's vision blurred. The world around him twisted. The ground shifted beneath his feet. The darkness swirled. But it wasn't the forest anymore. It wasn't the trees. Jonah was somewhere else, somewhere far darker. He was lying on the cold ground, his eyes wide, but unable to move. The figure was gone, but the presence, it remained, a feeling, a weight. Something else was there, watching, waiting. Jonah's pulse raced. The whispers were inside his mind now. The voices, all of them. Stop them dead. And then Jonah realized it wasn't just the forest. It wasn't just the figure. It was him. He was the one they wanted to stop. And now it was too late. That Jonah's heart thudded in his chest. A horrible truth settled deep within him. He had been the one to bring this upon himself. The whispers were his own thoughts. The figure his reflection. He could feel them now, the presence clawing at his mind. He wasn't alone. The weight on his chest grew heavier, as if the forest itself was pressing down on him. He tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth was dry, unresponsive. A strange pressure formed behind his eyes, like something was trying to push its way out. The voices grew louder, all around him, inside his head. Stop them dead. Jonah squeezed his eyes shut. Tears spilled down his face, but nothing changed. The figure was still there, not in front of him, not in the fog, but within him, in his very soul. He gasped. The realization hit him like a fist. He had summoned this, through his own fear, his desperation. The thing in the woods, the voices, they were him. He was the one who had stopped himself. And now he was trapped in the cycle, a loop he could never escape. The air grew thick again. The fog closed in around him, suffocating him. The trees loomed even closer. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as if it could crumble away at any moment. Jonah closed his eyes again, his breath ragged. There was nothing he could do now. It was too late. He had already become part of it. The figure, the whispers, the forest. He was no longer a separate being. He was the darkness. He was the one that needed to be stopped. And in the end, Jonah knew it was never about them. It was about him. And it was too late to stop it. The forest had already won. Jonah's vision blurred again. The edges of the world seemed to melt away. He felt himself sinking, deeper, deeper into the fog, into the blackness. The whispers continued, relentless. Stop them dead. He could almost feel the weight of their words pressing on him, a suffocating force that wrapped around his lungs, each breath harder than the last. Jonah wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but his body betrayed him. It was as though his limbs no longer obeyed, as if the forest had claimed him fully. There was no pain, just a cold, empty numbness. The figure's face appeared again in his mind, its pale, twisted grin, its hollow eyes, burning with a knowledge he could never grasp. It was laughing now, not with sound, but in the way the air shifted. The silence screamed in his ears. Stop them dead. It wasn't just the figure now. It was the forest. It was the ground beneath him, the sky above. It was the very nature of everything around him. And Jonah was part of it. He was the cause, the anchor. He had called it forth, and now it had consumed him. Jonah's heart faltered. His mind felt like it was splitting, but there was no escape. There was no way out. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, his own voice screaming within him. The fog was so thick now he couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Just the whispers, the figure, and Jonah's own sinking soul. Stop them dead, and in that final moment, Jonah realized it was too late to fight, too late to run, too late to escape. The forest had taken him, and it would never let go. Jonah's mind cracked under the weight of the whispers. He could feel the pressure inside his skull, like 1,000 hands clawing at his thoughts. He couldn't distinguish where he ended and the darkness began. It was as though the forest was in his veins. The air, thick and suffocating, turned to ice. He shivered, yet there was no warmth left. No escape from the cold that spread across his chest. The trees were no longer just trees. The ground beneath him was no longer solid. Everything moved. Everything was alive. Jonah felt it in his bones. The earth, the air, the darkness. It was all part of him now. He was no longer just a man trapped in the woods. He had become the woods. The figure's face flashed before him again. But this time, it wasn't just a figure. It was a reflection. Jonah's own face staring back at him, twisted and pale. Its eyes were hollow, its smile cruel. Stop them dead, the voice whispered. But it wasn't coming from the figure anymore. It was coming from Jonah's own lips, from his own mind. The realization hit him with a sickening clarity. The forest had never been the enemy. The figure was just a manifestation of his own terror, his own guilt. Jonah was the one who had summoned it, and now there was nothing left to stop, nothing left to save. The whispers died down, fading into the distance, and all that remained was the sound of his own breathing, shallow, weak. It was quiet now, too quiet. Jonah couldn't feel the ground beneath him anymore. He couldn't feel his body at all. The fog had swallowed him whole. The forest had claimed him. And as the last flicker of light left his eyes, Jonah knew. He wasn't escaping. He had become a part of the forest. The silence stretched on, thick and unbroken. Jonah's mind hovered on the edge of awareness, but his body was gone. His spirit, or whatever remained of it, drifted in the void between the trees. The fog had consumed him, its cold tendrils seeping into every part of him. There was no sense of time here, No sense of self. The forest had claimed him. And with it, Jonah's essence twisted into the shadows. It wasn't pain, not in the way he'd expected. It was something worse. It was as if he was fading, unraveling. The whispers, faint but persistent, hummed in his mind. Stop them dead. Now it was clear. He wasn't the one to be stopped. He was the one who had stopped everything else. His guilt had led him here. His fear. The forest had fed on it. Fed on him. It was never about survival. Never about escaping. Jonah had already given himself up the moment he first heard the whispers. He had summoned the forest unknowingly, and now he was one with it. The trees no longer creaked. The wind no longer howled. But something in the stillness felt alive. Watching. Waiting. Jonah couldn't move. He couldn't scream, but he could feel it. The pull. The force of the forest's hunger. It wasn't done with him yet. He had become a part of the story, a part of the forest's endless cycle. And in the dark corners of his fading consciousness, Jonah heard the words again. Stop them dead. This time they weren't whispers. They were commands. A command to stop everything. To erase it all. The forest had won. Jonah had lost. And as his soul merged with the shadows, he realized the truth. He had never been the hunter. He had always been the prey. The darkness grew deeper. Jonah's sense of self, once sharp, now felt like a distant memory. His thoughts were fragments, slipping through his fingers like sand. But the pull, the relentless pressure of the forest, still remained. It surrounded him, swallowed him whole. The trees loomed over him, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The fog thickened, dense and suffocating, wrapping around him like a shroud. There was no sound now, no whispers, no growls, just the oppressive stillness. Yet Jonah knew. He could feel it. The forest was never truly silent. It was always watching, waiting. Jonah's fading consciousness grasped at the remnants of his own mind, the sharp, desperate need to remember who he was, to fight, to break free. But there was no fight left in him, no will. The forest had already eaten away everything that made him Jonah. He had been reduced to nothing more than a shadow, a fleeting thought in the vast emptiness of the trees. And then he heard it again, the whisper. But this time, it wasn't inside his mind. It was all around him. Stop them dead. The words were sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. Jonah couldn't understand. There was nothing left to stop. It wasn't him they wanted to stop anymore. It was the forest. It was the cycle. The endless cycle. The trees whispered. The shadows shifted. The forest wanted more. It always did. Jonah was no longer the prey. He was something else now. Something in between. The dark had already swallowed him. But it wasn't done. He could feel it. The forest wanted to feed. And Jonah would never escape. The forest was alive. More alive than Jonah had ever realized. It breathed, pulsed, and thrummed with energy like a living, growing thing. Jonah could feel it now, seeping into him, filling the empty spaces within. His thoughts became jumbled, fragmented. They slipped away like fleeting memories, never to return. The darkness around him was not a void. It was an ocean. A deep, endless sea of shadow, and Jonah was drowning in it. The whispering voices were everywhere now, not in his mind, but all around him. The trees spoke, their branches creaking as if they were stretching, reaching toward him. Jonah could feel the weight of their gaze, pressing down on him. The forest had swallowed him whole, but it wasn't finished. It wasn't done with him yet. He could sense it. They wanted more. The cycle of whispers continued. Stop them dead. It was the forest's command, not for him, but for all the souls that had ever come before him, the ones who had vanished, who had become part of the woods. Jonah had thought himself a victim, But now he understood. The forest didn't take. It transformed. Those who came, those who stayed, became part of it. The dark, twisting roots of the trees reached into Jonah's mind, pulling at his memories, his past, his regrets, the things he had tried to run from. He could feel them unraveling, slipping from him, replaced by an insatiable hunger. Jonah wasn't just trapped anymore. He was becoming them. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Stop them dead. The cycle was about to repeat. Jonah could no longer tell where he ended and the forest began. He could no longer tell what was real. The hunger was all-consuming now. The forest wanted more. It wanted him. And Jonah understood. He had never been the last. He was just another part of the endless cycle. Jonah's mind, now little more than a flicker of his former self, fought against the suffocating pull of the forest. He could no longer feel his limbs, no longer distinguish the dark, damp earth from the very fabric of his being. His thoughts, those fleeting remnants of his humanity, dissolved with each passing second, leaving only an overwhelming, consuming hunger, a hunger that felt older than time itself. He tried to remember who he was, tried to hold on to the moments of his life before the whispers started, before the figure appeared. But those memories, once sharp and clear, now melted away like mist, disappearing into the dark void that had swallowed him whole. The whispers grew louder again. Stop them dead. Jonah's body, if he could even call it that, trembled, a sensation he barely recognized. His sense of self had shattered. There was no escape. The forest, now a part of him, surged with energy. It had taken him, claimed him, and was now feeding on him. He had never truly been the hunted. He had always been the offering. The trees began to move. Not physically, but within Jonah's mind, they stretched and reached toward him, their twisted limbs filling the empty space, wrapping around him. His consciousness flickered as the ancient hunger of the forest filled the void. It was no longer just him. There were others now. Their faces, distorted, hollow, rose from the ground like twisted echoes of the past. The forest had claimed them too. Jonah's body dissolved into the earth, his essence scattered like dust in the wind, mingling with the roots of the trees. The darkness no longer frightened him. It welcomed him, consumed him, as it had done with so many before him. The whispers now sang, low and haunting, filling the air with a promise. Stop them dead. And Jonah finally understood. He wasn't a part of the forest anymore. He had become it. He was the cycle, the hunger, the never-ending shadow that reached for the next soul to claim. The forest held its breath. Jonah, or what was left of him, could no longer tell the difference between the past and the present. The lines between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition. His body was gone, lost to the earth, to the endless dark. But his essence lingered, woven into the very fabric of the woods. His thoughts had become the wind rustling through the trees, the creaks and groans of the branches that twisted like forgotten memories. The whispers had faded, no longer commands, but gentle murmurs. They were no longer demanding, no longer urgent. They were a lullaby now, soothing, comforting. Jonah's soul had merged with the forest, becoming part of the eternal cycle. He was the shadows, the silence, the stillness. The forest had claimed him, as it had claimed so many before. But there was no fear now. For the first time since he had entered, the oppressive weight that had pressed on his chest lifted. The fog that had once swallowed him whole began to dissipate, and the trees no longer seemed to close in. The world around him, once dark and suffocating, now felt peaceful. Jonah couldn't remember what it was like to feel fear. There was no longing for escape, no desperate desire to flee. The hunger, the cycle, it had all become part of him now. And somewhere deep inside, Jonah knew he was no longer alone. The spirits of the lost were with him. their voices now a part of the forest's eternal song. They were not trapped, not punished. They were home. The wind whispered through the branches, soft and warm, as though the forest itself was exhaling after a long, terrible silence. Jonah's presence, his essence, was a part of that breath now. He was the forest, the earth, the sky. He was the dark and the light, the beginning and the end. And in that final moment, Jonah understood. The forest had never been his enemy. It was his home.